In the small town of Hollow Creek, nestled in the green folds of the Appalachian Mountains, Ethan and Sarah were a story, both admirable and mysterious. They had been married for over a decade childless, but bound together with an absolute devotion as if they were two separate trees sharing a single deep root system underground. As hardworking farmers, they shared everything: the scorching summer days in the cornfields, the simple dinners in their small log cabin, and the quiet ache of unanswered prayers. Many in the town admired their steadfastness. Others snickered behind their backs, whispering to one another. How could love survive without the laughter of children? But Ethan would just smile, wrap his arm around his wife, and reply, "Children are a blessing, but my wife, she is my whole life." When hope for a child by natural means began to fade, they pooled all their savings to visit a specialty clinic in the city of Raleigh. The old doctor, after a series of complex tests, delivered a harsh verdict Sarah could not conceive. The only solutions, according to medicine, were costly intervention methods, with uncertain success rates, or adoption. That night on the way home, Ethan held his wife's hand tightly, smiling gently through her tears, and said, "If having a child means I might lose you, then I'd rather choose this emptiness." Then the fateful day arrived. Ethan went alone to the western hill to mend a fence damaged by strong winds. As he was returning, the sky suddenly darkened. Black clouds rolled in from the mountain range, and the rumble of thunder sounded like the war drums of the ancient Cherokee who once lived on this land. As he hurried along the forest trail, an ancient oak tree already weakened by the previous week's storm snapped with a roar and came crashing down on him. The entire forest seemed to hold its breath, swallowing his final cry. That evening, when he didn't return, Sarah was only slightly worried. She thought perhaps he had taken shelter in the old shed on the hill to avoid the downpour. But just after midnight, she heard a knock at the door. "Sarah, my wife," a familiar voice called. "I'm so cold, let me in." His voice was so soft. She flung the door open. He stood there, soaked from head to toe, shivering. His skin was as cold as ice when she touched it. "My God, you're frozen!" she exclaimed, throwing her arms around him. But his arms didn't return the embrace, just hung limply at his sides. He said simply, "I'm tired." The rain was so heavy. The next morning, the air around Ethan and Sarah's house was strangely heavy. Ethan sat silently in the armchair on the porch. Tears streamed quietly down his cheeks. He looked shattered, as if bearing a sorrow no living person could comprehend. Still in shock from the previous night, Sarah knelt beside him. "Ethan, my love, why are you crying?" she whispered. He didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the wooden floor as if it held a truth he could not put into words. Then a noise came from the distance, panicked voices, rushing footsteps, and urgency tinged with fear. Sheriff Brody and two neighbors were approaching, their calls growing louder. Ethan slowly turned his head toward the noise. His eyes darkened, not with fear but with understanding. He looked at his wife one last time and whispered, "I have to go, Sarah." He stood up, went into the house, and a few moments later quietly slipped out the back door. Less than a minute later, Sheriff Brody and the two men burst into the yard, panting. "Sarah, Ethan's dead," Brody yelled, his voice hoarse. "I found him in the woods. A tree fell on him. The body is still there." Sarah was numb. "That's impossible," she cried out. "He was just here. He just went into the bedroom." One of the men with him, his face drained of all color, stammered, I saw him too. He just went around to the back of the house." The villagers, confused and frightened, decided to follow the sheriff. They followed the muddy trail into the oak forest, their hearts pounding in their chests. And there, under the massive storm-shattered oak, was Ethan's lifeless body, crushed, mangled, and still. Heart-wrenching cries filled the forest. Everyone was stunned, unable to believe their eyes. Some wept, others made the sign of the cross, muttering prayers. Sarah collapsed beside him. Her trembling fingers touched his cold skin. Her heart shattered in the horrific silence. The man she had slept beside, The man who had cried that morning had been dead all along. The man she had held in her arms was already gone. News of Ethan's death and his ghostly appearance spread through Hollow Creek like wildfire in a dry season. Children were forbidden to go out after dark, and doors that were never bolted were now securely locked. At the town's only diner, people no longer talked about corn prices or the upcoming football game. Instead, they whispered of spirits of broken boundaries and of poor Sarah who had held a ghost in her arms. Ethan's funeral was the most somber and heavy event Hollow Creek had ever witnessed. The entire town was there, packed into the small white wooden church, but not just to offer condolences. They came seeking some reassurance, a logical explanation from Pastor Michael for a completely illogical event. The pastor, a kind man with silver hair and shoulders weighed down by the burdens of his community, did his best. He spoke of the mystery of God's plans, of the power of love that transcends even death. But as he looked down at Sarah sitting in the front pew, as still as a statue, he knew his words were just empty sounds. Sarah did not cry. She was beyond tears. Her grief was deeper, a chasm of horror and confusion. The women of the church auxiliary took turns staying with her, bringing stews and cornbread, cleaning her house, and sitting silently by her side. They held her hand, patted her shoulder, but no words of comfort could touch the cold truth she was facing. She hadn't just lost her husband. She had shared a bed with death. She had wiped the tears from a soul that had already left its body. A few days after the funeral, Pastor Michael visited her. "Sarah," he said gently, "the community is worried. There's a fear spreading. Some people think something evil has happened here." Sarah just looked at him with vacant eyes. "I don't believe that," he continued. "I believe Ethan's love for you was so strong that it held him here, if only for a moment, to say goodbye." He cleared his throat, taking out a small Bible. "I'd like to say a few prayers to bless this house, to bring peace to you and to Ethan's soul." Sarah didn't object. She sat quietly as the pastor moved through the rooms, his deep voice reciting holy words, sprinkling holy water into the dark corners. It was a ritual to soothe the living and attempt to impose order on chaos. For the town, it was a cleansing. For Sarah, it was just a reminder that her home, once filled with laughter and love, had now become a haunted place. But while Hollow Creek tried to bury its dead and its fear, Ethan's spirit could not find rest. It was not bound by the clay grave or the church's prayers. It was a drifting consciousness, a wandering sorrow. It left the familiar hills, crossed roads he had never traveled, and drifted westward further and further from the only woman he had ever loved. Its journey ended in Havenwood, a worn-out old mining town tucked away in a remote West Virginia valley, a place time seemed to have forgotten. There, on the bank of a shallow creek, Ethan appeared again, not as a translucent phantom, but as a man of flesh and blood. He was found by a group of miners on their way home from work, lying unconscious on a bed of dry leaves. He had no identification, no money, and when he woke up in the town's small clinic, he had no memory. "What's your name?" the old nurse asked. He stared into space, his eyes empty. I don't know." The town called him the amnesiac stranger. He was a man of few words, with a gentle demeanor and a deep sadness that he himself did not understand. He took on odd jobs in exchange for food and a place to stay in the storeroom behind the general store. Then strange things began to happen. One afternoon, the store owner's young daughter came down with a high fever. She cried incessantly, and no medicines seemed to work. In desperation, the mother let Ethan watch her for a moment. He simply sat by the bed and placed his cool hand on her forehead. He said nothing, just looked at her with infinite compassion. A few minutes later, the girl stopped crying. The fever broke, and she fell into a peaceful sleep. Another time, an old miner was so crippled by arthritis he couldn't close his fist. Ethan was passing by as the old man dropped his coffee mug. He quietly picked it up, and when he handed it back, his hand brushed the old man's. A strange warmth spread from the point of contact. The excruciating pain the old man had endured for years suddenly vanished. He stared at his hands in amazement, able to flex his fingers with ease for the first time in a decade. Rumors began to spread. First whispers, then stories recounted with awe. People started seeking him out, the sick, the desperate. He never claimed to be a healer. He simply touched them, looked into their eyes, and it seemed some power flowed from him to them, mending what was broken, soothing what was in pain. He could look at a woman and tell her of the secret anxiety that gnawed at her, or look at a man and feel the burden of guilt he had carried since childhood. He didn't know how he knew these things. They simply appeared in his mind as clear as reading an open book. Gradually, the amnesiac stranger disappeared. Instead, he became known as Ethan the Healer of Havenwood. But behind it all, no one knew the truth. No one knew that he was not entirely human. No one knew that he was the restless spirit of a dead man, now wandering among the living, carrying a miraculous gift and a nameless sorrow. In Havenwood, Ethan's name was whispered with reverence. He was no longer the stranger sleeping in a storeroom. He had been given a small room above the clinic, and his door was never without a visitor. They brought not only their physical ailments, but also their wounded hearts. A wife sobbing over her alcoholic husband, a young soldier haunted by what he'd seen in the war, a mother grieving for a lost child. Ethan listened to them all, and somehow his quiet presence brought them peace. One evening, as the sunset painted the rugged peaks surrounding the valley, Red Ethan was walking down the town's main street. He saw Jedediah "Jed" Stone, the mine foreman, standing outside the saloon laughing boisterously with a group of miners. Jed was a large man carved from rock and coal, with hands that could snap a log in two. He was the pillar of Havenwood, the man who decided who had a job and who didn't. The coal mine was the heart of the town, and Jed was the one who kept it beating. As Ethan passed, Jed waved him over, his voice booming with self-satisfaction. "Hey, healer, come have a drink with us. See if your magic can turn water into whiskey." The group roared with laughter. Ethan just smiled faintly and was about to walk on, but as their eyes met, a chill ran down his spine. It wasn't a thought, but a vision as fast as a lightning strike, brilliant and terrifying. He saw darkness, the rumbling of rock screams swallowed by coal dust. He saw Jed's face twisted in fear, trapped under a broken oak beam. He could taste the dust in the air, feel the cold despair. Ethan stopped, his smile vanishing. "Jed," he said, his voice low and clear, cutting through the boisterous laughter. "You have to stop." Jed raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Stop what?" "Stop drinking. Stop sending men into tunnel number 4. Ethan continued, his eyes fixed on the foreman. "There's a shadow over that place. The mountain is groaning. The main support beam at the north entrance, it's rotten. You used pine instead of oak to save money. It won't hold." Silence fell over the group. The laughter died. Jedediah Stone froze, his ruddy face slowly turning a purplish shade. No one was supposed to know about that. A few months ago, to speed up progress and secure a hefty bonus from the parent company, he had ignored safety regulations and used a cheaper batch of timber to brace a new section of the tunnel. You dare slander me!" Jed roared, taking a step toward Ethan, his fists clenched. "What right do you have to talk about my work? You're just a drifter who doesn't even know who he is." "I don't need a right," Ethan replied calmly, unfazed by the large man's fury. "I only know what I see, and I see death waiting in that tunnel." "Liar!" Jed bellowed, swinging a punch at Ethan. But the other miners who had witnessed Ethan's miracles quickly held him back. Their faces were pale with fear. They knew Jed's recklessness, but they also knew the strange accuracy of Ethan's words. Furious and humiliated, Jed tore himself away from them. "This fraud is trying to divide us. He's jealous of the prosperity this mine brings." He pointed a finger at Ethan. "I'll give you one chance. You come before the mayor and the town elders tomorrow morning. Prove your accusations. If you can't, you'll be run out of this town like a rabid dog." With that, Jed turned and strode off into the darkness, leaving a tense silence in his wake. The next morning, Mayor Thompson's general store, which also served as the unofficial town office, was packed with people. The air was thick with anticipation and anxiety. Ethan stood calmly on one side. Jed Stone stood on the other, his arms crossed over his chest, a look of contempt on his face. Mayor Thompson, a small man with thick glasses, tapped the counter for attention. "Ethan," he said in a solemn tone, "you have made a very serious accusation against Mr. Stone here, a respected man in this community. This could cause a panic and harm the livelihood of us all. So do you have any proof?" Ethan looked around the room at the familiar faces he had helped. His gaze was calm but piercing. "Mr. Mayor, I have no proof that you can hold in your hand or see with your eyes. My proof comes from another place." Jed let out a sneer. "See? He has nothing, just the ravings of a madman." The mayor sighed. "Well then, this is slander," he declared. "And in Havenwood, that has consequences. To compensate for Mr. Stone's honor and to quell these baseless rumors, you will pay a fine of $100, and you will make a public apology." A murmur went through the room. $100 was a huge sum for someone like Ethan, but without a hint of protest, Ethan simply nodded. "I accept." He turned to Jed, but instead of offering an apology, he looked him straight in the eye and said, "I hope that money is enough to pay for the coffins." Then he turned and quietly left the store, leaving behind a stunned crowd and a mine foreman with a face as white as a ghost. 3 days passed. Ethan paid the fine with the spare dollars and coins the townspeople had given him as thanks. He did not apologize, and the mayor, in the face of his defiant silence, didn't press the issue. The town of Havenwood seemed to hold its breath. The miners went to work with a vague sense of dread. They glanced at Jed Stone with questioning eyes and looked toward the entrance of tunnel number 4 as if it were the mouth of a sleeping beast. Jed, to assert his authority and quash the whispers, doubled the work shifts in that very tunnel. "This mountain feeds us," he roared at the morning meeting. "Don't let the words of a stranger make you afraid." But the seed of fear had been planted. On the 3rd night, a cold rain fell on the valley. Ethan couldn't sleep. The vision of the disaster replayed in his mind, growing clearer, more urgent. He couldn't just sit by and wait for it to happen. He put on his old coat, pulled his hat down low, and slipped out into the night. He did not go towards the mine. Instead, he went to a small house on the edge of town. It was the home of Elias Vance, a retired old miner whose only son Caleb was working Jed's night shift. Elias was one of the first people Ethan had cured of chronic back pain. He trusted Ethan completely. Ethan tapped lightly on the window. Elias, his silver hair disheveled, opened the door holding an oil lamp. "Ethan, what is it?" "I need your help," Ethan said quickly, his voice urgent. "Gather the men you trust, the ones with Son's brothers in tunnel number 4 tonight. Tell them to bring picks and shovels. Meet me on the old trail behind the church in an hour. Don't let anyone else see you." Elias didn't ask a single question. He saw the truth in Ethan's eyes. He nodded and hurriedly got dressed. An hour later, under the faint light of a few storm lanterns, a group of nearly 10 men gathered on the muddy trail. They were fathers, brothers, friends, men with hearts heavy with worry. "Ethan, what are we doing here?" one of them asked. "We can't get in through the main entrance," Ethan explained, pointing toward the dark mountainside. "But there's an old air shaft boarded up for years. It leads directly to the northern section of Tunnel 4. We're going to dig it out." No one argued. With a silent determination, they set to work. The sound of picks and shovels hitting rock and dirt echoed in the rainy night. They dug with a frantic urgency driven by love and a primal fear. Their hands, blistered mud, streaked their faces, but they did not stop. Ethan worked alongside them, his energy seemingly endless. He wasn't just digging, he seemed to be listening to the mountain. He would place a hand on the rock face, close his eyes, and show them exactly where to dig. After nearly 2 hours, one of the shovels hit something wooden. They had found it the rotting wooden door covering the entrance to the old air shaft. Together, they pried it open. A gust of musty air smelling of coal and damp earth rushed out. "Caleb," My boy, Elias cried, grabbing a lantern and rushing in first. The others followed, their hearts pounding. They descended a narrow, steep passage, and soon they heard an ominous creaking, followed by a long groan of wood under immense pressure. They reached a ledge overlooking the main work area of Tunnel Number 4, and the sight below made them freeze. Dozens of miners, including their sons and relatives, were working under a rickety wooden support structure. And directly above them, the main pine beam that Ethan had warned about was bending, large cracks appearing on its surface. It could give way at any moment. Jed Stone was there too, yelling, pushing the men to work faster, completely oblivious to the danger poised directly over his head. "Get out! Everyone! Get out now!" Elias screamed, his voice echoing through the tunnel. The miners below looked up stunned. Jed spun around, his face changing color as he saw Elias's group. "What in the hell are you doing here?" But before he could finish his sentence, a loud crack split the air. The main beam snapped in two. For one horrifying moment, time seemed to stop. Then the entire roof collapsed with a deafening roar. Rock and earth cascaded down like a waterfall. Elias's group could only watch in horror. But something miraculous happened. The collapse wasn't instantaneous. The initial crack and Elias's scream had given the miners below a few precious seconds. Most of them, acting on instinct, had managed to dive into alcoves or safer side tunnels. When the dust settled, a dead silence fell. "Caleb!" Elias shrieked, scrambling down into the rubble. The others followed frantically, calling the names of their loved ones. Slowly, coughs and moans answered from the darkness. One by one, grimy miners crawled out from the debris, injured and terrified but alive. Only one person was unaccounted for. They found Jed Stone pinned under a large rock and the remains of the very oak beam he had failed to use. He was alive, but one of his legs was crushed. As they carried him out in agony, he saw Ethan standing quietly in the shadows. Jed's anger was gone, replaced by a profound shame and horror. You were right," he whispered before passing out. The cave-in changed Havenwood forever. It wasn't the deadly tragedy it should have been, but a near-miraculous close call. Jedediah Stone survived, but lost a leg in his career. When he regained consciousness, the first thing he did was confess everything, the cutting of corners, his recklessness, and the warning he had ignored. He told everyone that Ethan had saved them all. From then on, Ethan's name was no longer just whispered with respect. It was spoken with an almost sacred reverence. He was no longer the healer. He was the guardian of Havenwood, the man who had seen into the heart of the mountain and saved their children. Small gifts began to appear on his doorstep: a basket of fresh eggs, a loaf of warm bread, a jar of wild honey. He accepted them all with a humble smile, but as his fame grew spreading beyond the remote valley, a quiet fear began to creep into his mind. It wasn't a fear of death, he was all too familiar with that. It was the fear of being recognized. The fear that one day, a face from his past would appear, an old neighbor, a distant relative, or worst of all, Sarah. One autumn morning, as he sat quietly outside the clinic, he felt it. An unseen wind brushed his shoulder, not a wind of the earth, but a wind of fate. He closed his eyes and saw them, travelers on the road, a terminal illness, a dying woman. And he saw a familiar face, aged by grief, but still the face that haunted his nameless dreams. The face of Sarah's brother. "Oh no," he whispered to the wind. "Not yet." That night tragedy struck his own doorstep. Elias Vance, the old miner who had helped him warn the others, suffered a massive sudden heart attack. Caleb, his son, brought him to the clinic, his face pale with fear. "Ethan, please save my father." Ethan did everything he could. He used his hands, trying to will life back into the old man's fading body. But this time, his gift was not enough. As dawn broke, Elias drew his last breath in his son's arms. Elias's death shook the town. It was a bitter reminder that even their guardian could not defeat death. For Ethan, it was a sign. His work here was done. His presence, which had been a blessing, could now become a curse if his past found him. A few days later, while the town was still in mourning, an old road-dusted pickup truck drove into Havenwood. The driver was Mark Sarah's brother. With him were his wife and their father. In the back, carefully padded with blankets, was their mother, frail and weak, her breath rattling in her chest. She had a lung disease that the doctors in Raleigh had given up on. They had heard the incredible stories of a healer in a remote West Virginia mining town. It was their last hope. When Mark asked for the healer, the general store owner pointed him to the clinic. "But today might not be a good day," the man added. "We just lost a good friend." Mark nodded his thanks and walked toward the clinic. But as he got closer, he stopped. Standing on the porch, his back to him, was a man with a painfully familiar build. The dark hair, the broad shoulders. "Ethan," Mark called, his voice uncertain, almost a whisper. The man stiffened. He didn't turn around. "Ethan, is that you?" Mark stepped closer, his heart hammering in his chest. "My God, it is you." Ethan slowly turned. His face was leaner, his eyes held a deep sorrow Mark had never seen, but it was unmistakably him. It was the man they had buried almost 2 years ago. Shock contorted Mark's face. He took a step back, his hand raising as if to ward off a blow. "No, it can't be. We buried you. I carried your coffin." Ethan looked past Mark's shoulder toward the pickup truck. He could see the frail form of his mother-in-law through the window. He could feel their desperation. "I know," Ethan said, his voice raspy. "My work here is finished. Bring her inside. I'll see what I can do." In stunned silence, Mark and his father carried the sick woman into the clinic. They laid her on the small cot. Ethan approached, his eyes not on their astonished faces, but focused only on the dying woman. He placed his hands on her chest and closed his eyes. He wasn't there long, only a few minutes. When he opened his eyes and stepped back, a change had occurred. The woman's breathing became deep and even. A faint color returned to her gaunt cheeks. She opened her eyes for the first time in weeks with a look of clarity. "Mark," she whispered. While the family wept with joy and confusion, Ethan quietly left the room. He walked outside, down the dirt road, and toward the mountains that had given him sanctuary. He didn't look back. Mark rushed out after him. "Ethan, wait. Where are you going, Sarah?" "You have to see Sarah. Ethan stopped but didn't turn around. "Tell her I'm okay," he said, his voice carrying back over the growing distance. "Tell her not to cry for me anymore. The wind is gentle here, and the earth is light. And tell her it's time for her to live." Before Mark could say anything more, Ethan had walked into the woods and disappeared. When the family returned to Hollow Creek with a miraculously healed mother and an unbelievable story, the town was once again thrown into a state of confusion and awe. They went to the church seeking answers from Pastor Michael. The old pastor listened to the story, his face thoughtful. He looked at Sarah, who had sat silently through the tale, tears streaming down her face. They were not tears of grief, but of release, of a final understanding. "Ethan's spirit could not rest because he knew you were still suffering," Pastor Michael said in a contemplative voice. "His love for you gave him the strength to remain in this world, to heal the pain of others. But now his work is done. He has sent you a message. He has set you free." That night, Sarah dreamed of Ethan. He was standing on the bank of a river that shimmered in the moonlight. He smiled at her, the same smile that had once melted her heart. He said nothing, just raised a hand in farewell, then turned and walked into the silver mist that hung over the water. When she woke, Sarah knew what she had to do. The pain was still there, but it was no longer a burden. It had become a part of her, a warm memory of an extraordinary love. 6 months later, Sarah married a kind corn farmer, a good man who had quietly admired her for years. 2 years after that, at an age when everyone thought it was too late, Sarah became pregnant. When the baby girl was born, radiant and healthy, the entire town was speechless. They named her Hope, because they had learned that true love can overcome death, time, and sorrow. It can be reborn in other forms and heal what neither science nor reason can explain.